his record you. Turn it over to Esteban for his discussion of South American civilization. Let's give him a big hand. Thanks so much, Esteban.
Yo, thank you guys for attending your own class today to listen to me. So I will talk about pre-Hispanic South America civilization, specifically in the Andean region. Just a brief introduction. What we'll be talking about, I'm going to do a very brief overview in Mesoamerica. Can't talk about South America and the whole Americas in general without talking Mesoamerica. Then I will move on to describe the environment of the Andes and why it was populated by so many civilizations. Then I'm going to do a very brief overview into the main civilizations in the Andes. Then I'll talk about cultural practices of the body, specifically in the Andean region, and then I'll end in cranial vault modification, which was just skull shaping in the Andes, and that's part of my research. Just a warning, there are some slides that feature pictures of human remains, nothing too graphic or gory, but just putting it out there. Okay, Mesoamerica, which you'll talk to Dr. Stanley later in the week. Basically, it composed almost all of Mexico, except the northern part, and then almost all of Central America. Began around like 7,000 BCE. Very characteristic with the domestication of all these products. Then also the domestication of turkey and dog, but there's been some debate that the turkey was actually domesticated in New Mexico, so there's that. Then very large-scale agriculture, complex astrological, mathematical calendar system, numeric system, and it is one of the 6 regions of the world where writing independently developed. And this is Mesoamerica. So now I'll move it over to the Andes, which is what we'll be talking about today. So the Andes, you can see in this little map up here, right here. So it is South America. It comprises modern day Peru, Bolivia, Chile, parts of Argentina. It is the second highest mountain range in the world. It spans over 7,200 kilometers, which is the most of the continent it expands. It is a natural barrier, so anything east of it is pretty much jungle, so that's where you get into Paraguay and Brazil. Anything west of it is in the coast, specifically the Pacific coast, and there's a lot of highlands. So this environment in the east is what we'll be talking about. Anytime you hear Andean civilization societies, they're talking about this side by the Pacific Ocean, just because there's a lot. It's a very rich environment for civilizations to grow up in. As it was back then and it is today, a rural farmer in the Andes would probably travel up and down 15,000 feet in a single day. The way this was done is, as you can see, space is actually used vertically, not horizontally. So different types, different elevations for different zones for different types of agricultural practices. So for example, on the top, you would have your llamas and alpacas, which were your pack animals and also produced textile. So it was mostly grazing fields. And then later, as you went down, you could have tubers, which is mostly potatoes. And then as you were down, you'd be able to do more with agricultural products. But these products wouldn't survive the upper environments. This is a very brief chronology of Andean civilizations. I'm going to talk a little bit more in depth about a few of these, but just letting you guys know there's a lot of civilizations, which I don't have the time. I would need an entire semester to talk about all of them, but I'll touch briefly on the main ones. The early civilizations, Monteverde in Chile, which is right around here, It's a very, very big site. It is part of the pre-Clovis debate, which roughly puts it around 16,000 BC, which is earlier than the commonly agreed migration pattern. So it is pre-Clovis, there is a lot of debate. Most now the debate is on how old it is, but everybody agrees it is extremely old, and it's one of the most important sites in the whole continent. Norte Chico in Peru, which is right about here. We're going down in time, but it is the largest of the earliest civilization. It was about a millennium after Mesopotamia, but it was still earlier than the Olmecs. It was probably contemporary to the ancient Egyptian Empire, right at the height of when Upper and Lower Egypt were had the most influence. Then Paracas, Peru, it is best known for irrigation systems and complex textiles that still survive to this day. So here's just one small example. Okay, the first civilization I'm going to talk about in depth is Chavin. It is in north central Peru, mainly based on Chavin de Huantar, which is its seat. It is not an empire, but it did have large scale architecture, especially at Chavin de Huantar, which was a very, very big temple complex. There's been a lot of studies at Chavin try to determine the reason for the temple. There's a lot of like very intricate features in them. And lately the studies have all agreed that it was a ceremonial center. Inside the temple, there's a huge maze. So a lot of tunnels and walls. There's not a lot of light. And it ends right at the center of the maze. There's this 15-foot obelisk, monumental monolith that depicts, it's called the Lanzon, which means spear. It depicts his deity, but the interesting about it is it's three-dimensional. So it's not just a mural, it's an actual living statue. The theory, based on, they've done a lot of studies in the temple with acoustics, and they found also small irrigation canals. So they think they actually created this atmospheric effect. Most likely the priest would ingest hallucinogens and pretty much get high. So, and they would walk and do a whole journey, and then they would end up here. So if you imagine, it's all dark, you're listening to rainfalls or weird sounds, and then you end at this 15-foot statue of your god. So it's probably a very powerful impact. So it caused them to commune with their deities. So it's a very, very interesting site. Next one, Nazca. So Nazca, here's a 3D model of the environment. It's a very interesting environment because it has, it's in the low plains, but there's a lot of desert in it. So the Nazca people built these really complex underground aqueducts. They're called puquios. Here's a picture of them. And they were descendants of the early Paracas civilizations, but most people know them because of the Nazca lines. So the Nazca lines, they're large geoglyphs. They were not made by the aliens, but they were visible from high altitude. If you combine all of them, they're about 800 miles long. They were mostly zoomorphic, anthropomorphic, and geometric. Zoomorphic, meaning they had the shapes of animals. Anthropomorphic, there's a couple that have the shape of humans, and then they were mostly geometric lines. This is a satellite image. So as you can see, there's a lot of lines out there, and I'll show you images of the famous ones, but most, like 90% of them, are actually just straight lines. They were done pretty easily, actually. They just removed the topographic area here. The topsoil are reddish pebbles, so they will remove those and expose the yellow grayish subsoil. But because of the natural barriers here in the Andes and the mountain range, there was little to no wind erosion the last couple thousand years. So they were all preserved. And it was a very dry, arid environment, so there not a lot of rain, so nothing actually disturbed them. So which is why they're still seen today. Here's a few more examples of the most interesting ones. This is the spider one, the monkey, and the hummingbird. So there's been a lot of theories, including aliens, but the most prevalent theory about their purpose, it has to do with their position, and they think they're ceremonial pilgrimage centers. So what would happen in theory is during high feast days, there would be a procession. So people wearing very colorful clothing would walk along the lines of the Nazca lines. And there were viewing platforms up in the hills that you can actually view them. Like they don't need a spaceship or a plane to view them. You can just go up the hill and you can view them. So the theory goes that if you're looking at them from up top and people are walking in a straight line with colorful clothing during a procession, then these would look like they were moving. So that is the main prevalent theory. Obviously, it can't be explained, but a lot of the archaeologists agree on that. Moche culture. Moche culture, it's not really an empire. It's more of a large cultural system that's spread out. They didn't hold a lot of land or have a lot of political power, but their cultural system, which mainly the textiles and ceramic form, really spread out throughout the Andes. This is a tomb in Sipan that had a lot of like very intricate mortuary offerings. But they're mostly known for the moche pots. Now these are the most PG that I could find. They're actually called the moche sex pods or erotic pods. I'm not gonna show them here, but you guys can Google them at your leisure. Suffice it to say, they're very, very graphic. But they're very, very famous, and these spread out throughout the Andes and then across time. So they're very, very intricate. I believe they use them to drink chicha, which is a type of alcoholic beverage made from, I believe it's corn and spit. Then it was fermented. So yeah, but the mochi pots are really cool. There's a lot more versions of them that I wouldn't show, but you're welcome to look at them on your own. Yeah, they're mostly red and white, but they believe they probably had more intricate colors, but yeah, the red white wear is usually what survives.
What was that?
Oh no, that's fine. No, chicha.
They still drink it too.
Yeah, I think you can still get it. Yeah, with the spit and everything.
Old cream corn.
The next two civilizations, I'll talk to them in tandem because they're always referred to in tandem. So they were the Wari and the Tiwanaku. So the Tiwanaku, they were the southern ones, and they were mostly in the Bolivian altiplane, which is the highlands of Bolivia, mainly in Lake Titicaca. They had really, really advanced grasp of agricultural engineering, and they developed these agricultural terraces, which allowed them to reuse water and help farm areas of lands that were not really conducive for plain agriculture. And they were contemporaries with the Wari, which were in northern Bolivia, southern Peru. They were a militaristic society, which it's kind of related to its name, even though it's spelled wrong. And they were contemporaries with Tiwanaku, and they had an extensive, they were mostly well known for their extensive road system, monumental architecture. Finally, the Inca, which is the most well-known civilization. They were the largest empire in the Americas at the time. They're very, very similar to the Aztecs, which you'll find out in your Mesoamerican lecture, but keep that in mind because they share a lot of similar characteristics. They were actually, they started out as pastoralists, descended from Tiwanaku civilization. They spoke Quechua, which is still a modern language with their descendants. They were based in modern day in Cusco. This is actually a picture of Machu Picchu, which everyone's seen, so I had to include it. They're also really interesting because their bodies actually adapted to living in high altitude. Their lung capacity was a third more than what regular humans have, and they also produce more hemoglobin. They also, and this was not independent to them, it was independent to all Andean civilizations, but they use the coca leaf, which there's a deviation of the coca leaf is made into cocaine, but the actual leaf is a stimulant. So they discovered that it helped them survive very big changes in elevation. So if you're going from the coast to look at your alpacas 15,000 feet up and they walk down, a normal human being, that would take a toll on the body. But by chewing the leaf, it actually helped you control those changes and not get too sick. The Incas were also very famous by their architecture. They used little to almost no mortar. So you see these monumental walls in Cusco. These were all cut that way, and they were placed that way without mortar. So that just shows a very high level knowledge of engineering and mathematics to be able to achieve these rocks. And also, if they didn't have wheels, they were really advanced compared to other societies based on the monumental architecture. They incorporated the designs pretty much in everyday life. For example, their capital, this is modern day Cusco. And this area in red is what Cusco, the borders of Cusco, the old town, back when the Incas lived there. These were the borders, and it was actually simulated into the head of a puma, which was sacred to them. The Incas were an empire, but they didn't have writing system, no hieroglyphics, nothing. But how they were still considered an empire, even though one of the state qualities is to have a writing system. But they developed these record keeping system that was very, very complex. It was called a quipu. Basically, it was string and knots, and that's how they kept track. Especially, they were a large empire, so they had a lot of tax collectors and a lot of record keeping. So they come up with this system to keep track of most of their economy. So it was determined based on knots. They were given a numerical value, and it was also the location of the knots. So you have your primary and your secondaries, and then these often related to what was being calculated for the specific. So probably was this was a tax revenue for a particular community, and these were different streets, and probably each knot would be like a single individual or family. But yeah, it's pretty astounding what they were able to do without a writing system.
Quipu deciphered, or is it still being decided?
This is the most prevalent theory.
Yeah.
And
some stuff that maybe there's other things going on as well, maybe words or something.
Yeah, that's another theory, that it's, especially with the descendant communities, that it was just not just numerical, it was also categorical data that was stored in there. But a lot of the records are Spanish, so they don't really correlate with it too much. But there probably was, if they were this intricate with numbers, they probably had more to do with categorical data storage. So it was actually, there's not a writing system, so it's actually more advanced than a writing system. A writing, you just write this. The Kipru was actually kind of like a computer. It was a storage system, which actually stores information, not just writes. I need to talk about llamas and alpacas because they're central to the Andes, but they were also the reason the Incas grew to power. They were pastoralists, and they pretty much had a large number of them, and it began as a surplus, and that's how they built their economy to turn it into an empire. They're domesticated animals from the wild vicuñas. They can interbreed if need to. This is the llama, this is the alpaca. The llama is a little taller and skinnier, and the alpaca is more stout. They were not used like horses. They were mostly used for their textile, for grazing, and as pack animals. And textiles still to this day, especially alpaca, are very high priced. Okay, now I want to talk a little bit about cultural practices of the body, especially in South America. Obviously, the main one is sacrifice and auto-sacrifice. Auto-sacrifice was in the form of bloodletting, which was practiced by many civilizations, such as the Maya, the Olmec, and the Inca. So basically what the bloodletting was to offer up your fluid, specifically the blood, as a sacrifice to a deity during a specific ritual, or if you were captured as a prisoner. Another cultural practice was the practice of trophy heads. This happened in mostly with the Nazca. So you can see this is a mummified head with a rope stuck in it, and these are non-mummified skulls, but you can still see the hole where they would keep them. Initial theories were they were prisoners of war, and these were being kept as trophies. Now there's more in-depth research, and it's probably more nuanced. There's more theories now that it was actually ancestor veneration, and not just our Western views on slavery and holding a trophy as conquering someone else. So they think there's more nuanced views. So there's a lot of more theories about it. Next, trepanation. Trepanation is very, very interesting. So this is still practiced today in medicine. Trepanation is actually holes in the skull drilled or removed to relieve pressure. So if someone has an infection or skull trauma, their brain is going to swell, and likely that's going to cause a fatality. But if you remove certain parts of the skull, you can actually relieve the pressure and the brain shrinks, which will not lead you to death. So there's been evidence, especially in this one, you can really see that it healed over, that the Incas, for example, practiced trepanation. So the fact that they were doing head surgery back then with probably obsidian instruments, they didn't have metal instruments, just really shows how advanced and what depth of knowledge they had of the human body and health and disease. Yeah, this is a really good book that talks about it if you guys are interested, but yeah, the fact that they were doing it way ahead of any of the modern civilization is really interesting.
On the right side, there's the little holes.
Yeah, they think these were this one was more of a practice one. Yeah, this one is little healed. This one's healed for sure, but this one thinks it might have been like a medical student or
practice on a dead person.
Yeah, pretty much. This one's healed. This one you can really see, the incision and everything, and you can see the healing, and there might have been a little bit of infection after. But this one's fully healed. So it just shows that.
How can you tell something is, because if it's healed, it means that the person survived, right? That's the idea.
Right.
And so how can you tell as a bio-art person if something is healed versus if it's they did it and somebody died?
Yeah, so for example, this one, you can tell the edges, they're very sharp and rough. And this one, you can tell the edges are rough, so that means it heals, but it probably healed and maybe caused an infection because it's not all the way healed, especially these incisions. So it's usually by the lipping of the edges where you can tell if something's healed or not. Mummification, obviously practiced in a lot of ancient societies. The Andes also practiced it. It started in desert environments or high altitude environments, and it was a natural process. It just happens if it's low aerobic content or low moisture content causes the mechanisms that accelerate decomposition to stop, which mummifies the body. So the body is able to survive in these states. Obviously, it evolved into very complex mortuary practices all the way to the Inca, but it started as a natural process for desert communities.
This textile they were in all original stuff.
Yeah, a lot of, especially, I believe she was really high in altitude. Yeah. So I don't think encased in ice, but definitely like really like low temperature. So that helped preserve. And then especially if they were buried, then the textile, that's when you see the breaking down of the textiles. But some of them that were exposed, the textile actually remains just because there's no, the soil, the acidity in the soil is what disintegrates the textiles. Okay. It just depends. There is just different types of mortuary practices. Basically, the theory, and this is the same theory they have for mummies in ancient Egypt, was that the natural process, they witnessed the natural processes of mummification in the desert or high altitude environments, and they incorporated those into their own mortuary practices. So they realized like, oh, my ancestor that we left to die 100 years ago is still alive. And slowly throughout the years, they adapted that process. And for example, like the ancient Egyptians, they actually perfected that process.
It was a form of like ancestor worship or veneration.
Yeah, that was highly likely. It could have been just part of like everyday ritual, but most likely was a form of ancestor veneration. Finally, I'm going to talk about cranial vault modification, which is a type of head shaping. It is found in almost all ancient societies, different types of it, but predominantly in pre-Hispanic South America. There's two types, mainly intentional and unintentional. Intentional happens when you visibly you shape the head to create a visible outcome. Unintentional is usually the byproduct of child rearing practices such as cradle boarding. So there's been many theories about why the skull was modified. Most prevalent theory, especially in Indian societies, is that it was an identity marker. So it was a visible representation of an individual and their relationship to the community. The two main types occur via the type of modification, so the way that they were modified. This above here is a tabular type, and this was achieved through head binding. And you would apply frontal and occipital, so front and back pressure, to flatten the skull, which created this bilobate shape, which these protruded out to the sides right here. But most of the pressure was here, and that's the direction the skull would go. The other type is called the annular type, and that is actually more prevalent in Mesoamerica, but it still happened in Indian America. But what's interesting about this is there is no actual binding. This is all circumferential pressure it's pressure around 360 through bands and ropes, and it's just the tightening of it, which creates this really smooth cylindrical shape and very elongated shape. Most of these were done with no harm, almost all of them with no harm. They lived, their cause of death was never related, just based on their age. This could only be done between newborns and 3 years old, because the skull at that time is actually, it's not a single skull. It's made up of like very, even the main bones are broken up in smaller bones. So the plasticity of the skull at that age, the plasticity just means how malleable it is. It's able to make it grow. So it's not shaped in the way that you would shape pottery. It's more unidirectional growth, meaning you're telling the head, I want you to grow this way. And over time, it grows that way. But it can only happen at certain age. Obviously, after that, there is no plasticity to the skull, so you would just create trauma and probably die. But they really, really elaborated the practice, and even pre-archaic, like the earliest settlements, they already had that practice in place. So my thesis project, I'll come back to that slide. Basically, I have two research questions that I'm going to try to answer with my thesis project. I have skeletal samples from different sites in South America. They vary across time and obviously space. There's one Patagonia, and then a bunch in Peru, either highland or coastal, and then some in Chile. Basically, I take all these samples. It's 3D data, so they've all been scanned, and it's a 3D image. So these are actual images, and then I assign them modification type visually. So based on visual instructions, I can tell this is occipital flattening, this tabular erect, this is annular. So I assign one of these. After that, they are processed in 3D image software. So this is an actual screen grab of what I do. So I take 10 landmarks, specific predetermined landmarks of the head. Each landmark generates coordinates. So it's like a coordinate system. And all those points create numbers. Those numbers become the data. And then I run advanced multivariate statistics to determine if there's any relationships. So I'm going to use that data to answer two questions. First is, can the use of geometric morphometrics, that's actually what I'm doing here in taking the measurements and obtaining coordinates. Can the use of these methods aid in distinguishing between types? Because these types, they're visual assessed. So that means there's a lot of inter-observer error. I can say this looks oblique, and then someone can come that has studied in the Andes for 15 years and be like, actually, this is annular. So there's a lot of discrepancy between types because it's just a visual assessment and we're all human. So I'm trying to determine if metric methods actually give you a more precise way to determining the type. Then my next question is to explore any temporal, that means across time, or regional relationships between these communities. Because cranial ball modification at its core was an identity marker to each community. So I want to look at the modification in these different communities and see, are there any relationships? Were there any prevalent types that occurred in this community and in this one? Does that mean that these two communities had common ancestors, or were they communicating with each other and there was a cultural diffusion? So their cultural practices and ideas were transported across space and time. So, and also, my last question is about identity, and what can the study on this specific biocultural practice tell us about the identity and personhood of these specific communities? So that's basically my research. little bit on my thesis project and my life as a grad student. You started with a research question, especially in biological anthropology. It's more necessitated on what do you have access to. So what type of skeletal sample you had access to. I had access to these specific samples because of my previous advisor, Dr. Kuzmiski. She worked in the area, she had access to these samples. So after I have both of those, then I started my background research. So that's when I learned everything about all these Indian societies and the different types of modification, and also pediatric brain plasticity and all that kind of stuff. And then I did an early pilot study, just looking at the research and trying to see what type of these two types where they were based out of, and what regions they were mostly found of, so I can support my own thesis that I knew which regions it was. After that is a data collection, which I just finished. And that means going in and taking and assigning this. Then I also assigned sex determination based on skull morphology. And then I took each of the measurements. And then each of the measurements needed to be transferred over to a spreadsheet and like arranged a certain way. And then after data collection, I do the statistics and the analysis, which is where I'm at. And then hopefully I'll start writing and finishing some of my thesis to present and defend next semester. But that's the nutshell of a graduate student. Basically, the first 3 you'll do, if you do a 2-year program, you'll do the first year, depending on your advisor to you, and then the last you'll do your second year. And usually the summer in between, that's when you do your data collection if you need to travel or something along those lines. And that's pretty much it. If you guys are interested in any of these, just shoot me an email. I can send you this presentation or the references I used. I used a lot of like Indian archaeology books, but a lot of them should be available to you guys.
Five minutes left. So if any of you would like to ask us on any questions or question and answer session, it could be about Indian civilizations in general. It could be about his research and maybe some of the things he discovered, or it could be questions about grad school, like how you decided you wanted to be an anthropologist with your life, or what's your favorite thing about grad school, or whatever, right? So we got about 5 minutes. So if you'd like to ask some questions, just raise your hand and Vaughn will give you that out.
So the heads, they would find them, get them to that shape?
Yes.
For what reason?
So that they were an identity marker. So that means specific shape would mean that you would relate it to a particular community. And then a lot of these, especially in the Mayan, they corresponded with religious headdresses. So there is possibility that it was some of them, there was a differentiation between elite and non-elite in the Mayan. In the Indian, it's not the case, it's different. So different societies did it for different things. And when you guys learn about North America, it was mostly unintentional. So it was just cradle boarding that caused the head shape to change, but not actually intentional. Questions? Comments?
And that Oklahoma, it's like, this is not Oklahoma, right?
Yeah.
Yes, the chicha. Yeah, it's very interesting.
Still drank in the community that I.
Did you drink it for real?
Yeah, it's gross, and it's even grosser because it's out of a communal pot. Yeah, it's real good. It's like if you left cream corn, you started eating a big pot of cream corn, you left it out for a week or so, and then invited your friends over to come get drunk.
Did you catch a buzz or what?
Oh, yeah, it's really strong. And it looks exactly the same coming out when you throw it up. It's like corn.
Yeah, really interesting.
Other questions? What's your favorite part about being a grad?
My favorite part. I think it's, well, not all the time, but it's nice to be able to do your own, like what I want to do, you know? There's, in every class, you know, there's aspects you like about it, but 80% of the reading you do in any particular class is not something that you'll ever enjoy or want to, which is what I think makes homework so hard for most people all the time, because it's not something every lecture that you do, it's not something that you want to read about. And the good thing about picking your own research in grad school is that you enjoy it more because you're reading what you want to read. Not all the time. There's a lot of, you know, the theory stuff that you don't want to be reading, but most of the stuff, it's something that you're interested in. So it makes it, all the work that you do makes it pass quicker or be more enjoyable because it's something that you want to do.
And if some of our students were interested in going to grad school, either here or somewhere else, what kind of tips or tricks would you tell them to do to get ready or to make yourself a good candidate?
I would say you don't necessarily, I didn't set out like, oh, I want to do, you know, Andean stuff, but I knew I wanted to do bioarchaeology, which is human remains in an archaeological context. So if you have an overall idea of where you want to go, then talk to the people professors in advance and ask them about the program. Especially there's some programs that are more suited to certain types. So it might not be the best program. There's also, there's an idea, I don't know if it's true or not, but it says that you shouldn't go to grad school where you went to undergrad. Some programs are like that, others are not. So just because, not that the program you went to already has doesn't have enough knowledge, but you're supposed to be exposed to different types of knowledge. So there's that idea, but also it's easier to get into a program where you're already the undergrad. And especially if they have a lot of diverse classes just for graduate students, then that helps a lot because you already know the program and you know the people. So that you already have a leg up if you're applying to your own. If you're an undergrad, and you want to apply to grad school where you're at, then it makes it easier because you already know most of the professors. But there is something to be said, we're gaining different knowledge from somewhere else. So it's just, it just depends basically which area you want to go into and what are your interests. Usually like whatever you're interested in, especially if you're interested in lithics from South America, then start a Google Scholar search and see who is doing that type of research and which schools they're at. And then contact them and see if they're taking grad students. And just proofread everything, even if it's just your personal statement, just talking about you. If there's a typo, even the emails you sent, just make sure everything is proofread. I would say that's the biggest thing. If you get an email that someone's, you know, there's no spelling, there's a lot of spelling errors or like grammatical errors, then probably that person is not even going to respond to it.
Yeah. Is there any other final questions? Wrap up for today. Thanks so much. Let's give a final round. Well, Wednesday we're going to finish up our old world civilizations of ancient China and ancient Greece, and on Friday we're going to go over to the organics. We're going to learn about see ya. Thanks so much. That was good. The whole time. That was the whole time. I knew it would take up more.
Yeah.
Usually,
Yeah, when you're
practice, you just kind of go and go.
Yeah.